How to draft good disclosure. Trust me, this panel is mind-blowing. Stick through the entire thing. Lily Brown, who's a partner at WilmerHale here in Washington, D.C., used to work at the SEC. She was senior special counsel to the director of the Division of Corporation Finance. She's amazing. Keir Gumbs, also a former SEC alumni, was a counselor to a commissioner, worked in other roles at the SEC, worked at Covington and Burlin, worked at Uber, and now is chief legal officer at Broadridge and the chair of the Society of Corporate Governance. They do an amazing job today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. How to draft good disclosure. I have my good friends Lily and Keir, who started, it sounds like they separately at the SEC. And this is back in an era when you would, at least in my experience, you would finish law school, you would received a job at the SEC, and a new class would come in the fall. So when I started in 1988, there were 6 of us that started the same day. And not necessarily that we all became best friends, but a couple of us every year on our anniversary start date would go into the basement and get a donut together to commemorate our start date. So it's kind of cool. I don't think they have classes like that anymore because most of the hires are lateral, or usually there's a freeze at the SEC. But it is kind of funny that for those of us who have been started at the SEC long ago, we were part of a class, and to some extent, I guess that meant something. But we are going to talk about how to draft good disclosure. So, Keir, I'm going to start with you. When you're working on brand new disclosure, some new development perhaps, or there's a new SEC rule requirement, what is your recommended process for starting?
First of all, Brock, great to see you, and Lily, you too. And the first day of class thing is very true. I still feel a strong affinity for all the folks we started with at the same time. So, and that includes Lily, one of my favorite people. So, Brock, for me, I think the process has evolved. I in most cases, I always start with what does the actual rule say? When I was at the law firm, that would start with actually reading the release in cover to cover, working through the rule text itself, and then starting the thought process around disclosure. Now that I'm in-house, I have to say I feel a little bit more lazy because it starts with reading the law firm memos and figuring out all the different perspectives that the firms have. And what's interesting is they differently have very different takes on different things, which you kind of pick at as you start to think about what the disclosure is. Once you have that background, for me, at least in-house, the process usually starts with figuring out what it is that we've got that might support that potential disclosure. So, we're looking at a new human capital rule, for example, that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years in our 10K disclosures. And for that, both here and at my last company, it really started with what kind of data do we have around our human capital practices? And some things are easy, like the number of employees. We definitely have that. But then other things are harder. What level of disclosure around diversity do we want to provide? What level of disclosure around our programs and benefits do we want to provide? And again, assessing what we've got really helps because in some cases I've got low hanging fruit. We've got this disclosure, we've got this data already. We don't have to create something new. So then it's just a question of whether we disclose it or not. In other cases, you don't have it. And then it's a question of, well, do we need to, what do we need to put in place in order to start creating those disclosures? All along, I would say the next most important piece for me is doing as much benchmarking as possible. And so, at Broadridge, I'm very lucky. We're June 30 year end. So for a lot of new disclosures, I have the benefit of seeing what everyone else does before we put our 10K disclosure together. But I do think that benchmarking process, which I think we're going to come back to later, is super, super critical in figuring out what's the lay of the land, because the last piece before you actually start writing things is the change management inside a company, which is, talking with executives, talking with the effective business owners, so they know here's the disclosure we're going to be making. Here's what the implementations might be. Do you have any concerns? Do you have any thoughts, any feedback? And, it's not a process that I anticipated being so essential when I was, outside counsel. But, both here and at my prior company, it's critical to make sure that everyone and management is aligned. Because the last thing you want is to put the disclosure together that's wrong or that creates a bunch of issues that the executive management team is uncomfortable with. And so I do think that step of the process is really helpful for people who are in-house. And then after I've done all of that, you actually get to drafting. And I'll just stop there, because in some ways, the drafting itself is the easier part. The hard part is figuring out all the other things along the way.
And Lizzie, how
So,
about you?
yeah, as usual, I agree with Keir. It's always funny when you, I mean, I think most of us do this, but it's always funny when you talk to someone who spent time at the SEC, because no matter how long we've been practicing, I mean, I work closely with Meredith Cross, who's been practicing for a very, very long time. I've been practicing for a pretty long time at this point, and you always go back to the rule text. You always look at the rule. So I too start out by, kind of going through the rule text. I'll read the kind of the beginning of the release that summarizes the parameters of what's happening. But at the end of the day, it always kind of comes down to the rule text. So when we take, and I'm coming from the perspective of being at a firm, when we, when that release initially hits after the open meeting, we kind of all scurry and take a look at it and start by, kind of outlining what's different from what had been proposed, what are kind of the big things. But then when you're actually sitting down to start drafting the forms that we're all going to start from, because we know clients are going to want to know immediately, what does this mean for me? You start with the rule text and kind of bullet out what the new disclosures are. Again, you look at the adopting release for the general parameters, but then you go to the rule text, go through that. And then if there are places, at least for me, where there's lack of clarity, then you may go back and see whether the release has any nuggets about what the staff at what ultimately the commission was thinking in adopting a particular rule. What type of information is trying to be solicited? What's the policy, as much as that can be gleaned from the release, so you can kind of come up with disclosures that are compliant but also clear, right? For me, disclosure is all about clarity. You want it to be accurate, you want it to be complete, but also clarity, right? You can say all kinds of things that are true, but if people can't read it and understand it, it's not that helpful. So kind of starting by bulleting out what the new disclosure obligations will be. Sometimes it's a whole new universe, a whole new form. We probably all remember conflict minerals, right? When it was just starting fresh with a new form, new disclosures. More recently, we have had a lot of new disclosures coming our way. So we're all having to go through this process pretty regularly, but most of them are fitting into, an existing 10K form 10K structure or proxy or whatever. So we're trying to kind of fit them in. So there may be blocks of new disclosure, and then you have to kind of go through and tag what other disclosures within a document could this impact. There are always going to be items where there are interpretive questions, or generally there will be. We've seen a lot of that over some of the rulemaking in the last year. And there again, you start with the release, and then if it isn't kind of addressed there, you're going to have to, kind of utilize logic, what would make sense for this to mean in the context of what the SEC is trying to do. And then as market practice develops, you can look to that. Sometimes the staff will give guidance in certain areas. Sometimes the market will figure something out and do it, and the staff will leave it be, and everyone's kind of happy. And so there are different ways that you can kind of get clarity around interpretive questions on a new rule. And then, we all kind of understand, I think, that disclosures may evolve over time. It may evolve in the few weeks to months or whatever that you use to come up with the disclosures before filing. And then it continues to as filings start being made. Those companies that aren't the first out of the gate are going to have the benefit of what's going to come out first. But, there's always someone who has to be first. So you kind of do the best that you can with kind of those baseline foundational themes of, compliance, of course, accuracy and clarity. And, again, we have so much coming out these days that we're all kind of figuring things out as we go. What is it? Building the airplane while it's flying. So we're all getting pretty good, I think, at coming up with these outlines and then evolving and keeping track of practice and kind of just doing the best we can. So.
Yeah, I always think that the pace of change must have been at a peak, and then particularly during the pandemic. And then here we are in really an unprecedented pace of rulemaking with the current SEC. So Lily, I'm curious, since you're in a firm, when you're looking to help a client with their disclosures, do you look at peer disclosures, and then what types of peers would you look at?
Sure. So, I mean, different clients will want different levels of benchmarking, but I generally will start with some combination of the proxy peers, right? The folks that are listed in the proxy for compensation purposes, and then industry peers to the extent that there may be some that are different and kind of in a specific industry group. And then the other thing that I think is generally useful, because I always want to make sure that the in-house folks I'm working with, kind of feel prepared for the different questions and inputs they may get. And they're generally thinking about this too, but going ahead and looking at the disclosures of companies that board members may have relationships with, right? So if a board member is the CEO of this other company or is on the board of this other company, they're going to bring that experience to their other company, and that expectation and kind of understanding of practice. So it doesn't mean that disclosures have to be exactly like that, but I always like to make sure that the in-house folks kind of have that and can anticipate questions or expectations from board members to the extent that they are engaging on a new disclosure. But you really, I benchmark just so I will know, but then for a particular company who may want to make sure that they're kind of in line with what all of the other whatever members of the industry group are doing, I will let that guide. Some will say, I want to, and by the way, some companies will just say, I want to know what X, Y, and Z are doing. And that's what I really want to know. For my knowledge, I probably will just look further, but I also, different companies will have different feelings about how broadly they want to benchmark.
And Keir, you touched on this topic. What's your perspective?
I was going to say, as usual, I agree with Lily, and especially on the benchmarking around directors. It's so true. It's so important to do that, and I almost feel like it's like the secret sauce for a good way of managing a board and executives through a new disclosure change. And that's because, to Lily's point, they bring that with them. And if I had $1 for every time, a director or an executive questioned a disclosure or proposed a disclosure that was based on what their prior company or a company they're on the board of is doing, like I wouldn't be a millionaire. I'd probably have enough to buy a car because it's so common. And so I think that's really critical. And so the way that I've always approached it is very similar to what Lily said. I always start with, who are our peers? And for peer purposes, there's sometimes you look at the compensation peers, which makes a lot of sense, especially for the compensation related disclosures. Doesn't always make sense for the governance related disclosures. There may be reasons that that peer group may not be the right peer group for thinking about governance related things, but there should be that kind of that industry peer group. And then I also like to have benchmarking based on who are the leaders. And it can be leaders in the industry or more broadly. So at Uber, we had this view as we were working towards the IPO that we wanted our governments to be leading best in class for technology firms. And so even though they weren't technically our peers yet, we looked at, Amazon and Apple and Google, some of the larger tech firms, Microsoft, to say, what were they doing? And even if they weren't peers from an industry group perspective, they were viewed as technology peers and companies that had leading practices. And then my third bucket consistently was the bucket that Lily was describing with directors. And so literally every time we were thinking about a new governance change or disclosure change, we looked first, what are our industry peers doing? What's the kind of the leaders in technology doing? And then what are the firms that are associated with our directors doing? And then based on all of that, that helped us evolve the disclosures that we were making as an organization.
So when I was in-house, which was 25 years ago, it's hard to believe, it was Lockheed Martin, and the general counsel wanted me to fly around to all our big bases of operations to do diligence when I would work on the 10K to help me understand perhaps what pieces of disclosure might be updated. But to be honest, the disclosure did not change much from year to year. The SEC was barely doing any rulemaking, and the business didn't change much. Things sure have changed a lot. So Keir, when you are Yeah.
Can I stay on that just for a second on what's
Sure.
changed? The other thing that's changed in that 25-year span are the tools that you can use for doing the benchmarking. And I would say, two things. First, and I'm not to pitch anybody else's products, but I will say when I was in private practice, Intelligize first came out. And for me, it was totally revolutionary because suddenly you can look at, a peer group that you created, 25 peers or 100 or whatever it is, and the snap of a button or click of a button, you suddenly had this really detailed benchmarking information you could generate. And so that's, I think, something that people should take advantage of. One of the things that we're all kind of working towards right now is new ESG disclosures. And one of the things that we've used last year, we used a law firm and two consulting firms to put together benchmarking on ESG. This year, there's a tool that we developed that basically has it looks at ESG disclosures in companies' ESG reports or sustainability reports, and it lets you look at things based on your peer group. It makes you look on your industry group. So we're in the S&P 500, for example. You can look at specific companies if you wanted to compare or contrast. You could say, well, who's reporting to SASB? Who's reporting to GRI? So the point is, the tools that people have available to them now have changed. And I think it's like revolutionized the way that companies can do this peer grouping, this benchmarking exercise. And so, again, I use the Intelligize for kind of disclosures, general disclosures, and we use this ESG analyzer. And I would say that those kinds of tools make it, I think, wildly better for people who are putting together these disclosures, just to see what everyone else is doing and what kinds of disclosures they're providing and where they're providing them.
Yeah, and I'll say I've actually been talking to a number of vendors that have generative AI products that are about to emerge on the market that's going to, and maybe Intelligize will be one of those, that's going to even take that way much further. It's mind-blowing what's going to be feasible soon. And I'll be conducting some videos with some of those people soon enough. But anyways, what I was getting at, Keir, is when you are updating a piece of disclosure, what are you looking for to change? How much diligence do you conduct?
Okay, so I want to hear Lily's views on this. My view has changed since I became in-house. I think, frankly, when you're in-house, it is much harder to change things. It is hard because no one wants to change anything. Like literally, no matter what the circumstances are, people do not want to change things. And so it makes it very, very hard. So you really have to come in and say, here's why I'm making this change, and here's how I think it's going to be received, and here's the rule or the market change or the SEC comment that's driving it. And I'll just give you one very easy example, MD&A. So MD&A is one of these areas of disclosure that's kind of a combination of the lawyers and the financial reporting people coming together. And I would say, in my experience, MD&A is one of those places where if you want to make changes, particularly setting aside like the period-to-period comparisons, of course, those are going to change. It's more of the trends and uncertainties, the description of capital resources, all of that kind of stuff that's not directly tied to what happened in that reporting period. You really have to come in and say, I've looked at the benchmarking, going to the last question, or here's 10 SEC comments that have come in that have basically suggested we need to be providing A, B, or C disclosure, and make the case for that kind of disclosure. And so the point is, going to your question, it's really hard to make those changes. You have to, I think, as an in-house lawyer, you have to have all of your ducks lined up in terms of why you're making the disclosure, what the benchmarking is, if it's SEC driven, what the SEC has said. You have to be prepared with the assessment of risk. If we don't provide it, here's what will happen, or here's what we're risking, that sort of thing. And so I think the bias is towards not changing disclosures unless you really have to. And I think that's just to own it. Like, that is the reality when you're in-house. I didn't anticipate that the level of pushback you get when you're in-house to making that kind of change. When, I was at a law firm, I would say, well, you need to do this, that, or the other. This is what came out of our form check. Here, take it, throw it over the fence. But when you're in-house, it really is a challenge. You really have to make the case for it. And I'd say because of that, I tend to only make the changes that I think, I had a rule when I was at Uber. We had a rule. Anytime we debated something more than a couple of minutes, it was on the table for disclosure. It wasn't because if we're thinking that something needs to be disclosed based on what we know, it's very likely the market might also be wondering that same question. And that I think led to a better overall disclosure outcome, because we knew that all the big topics we were putting on the table and everybody was there with it. But again, the bias was towards not making changes.
So that's one of the most important things I think I've learned, and in my time in private practice, is that each comment, I mean, there are some folks who want to know we think this word would be better than this, and that's totally fine. And I think this goes to the point of making sure that you kind of know the culture and the expectations and the wants before you kind of throw things over the fence or whatever. But yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that I have learned over time is kind of putting myself in the shoes of the person who needs to go and explain to however many people internally why these 5 words need to change or should change. And so I guess I approach it as first, kind of knowing the client and the ask, thinking about the kind of external factors that are in play, right? Okay, everyone's dealing with inflation, or most people are dealing with inflation and supply chain issues right now, looking through a filing and saying, okay, I don't see any reference to this, and asking the question, have you been impacted by supply chain issues, and if so, is it material? And are there things in the risk factors or the MD&A or whatever that would cover this if it's kind of it's in the offing but no really specific events or impacts to be disclosed, but kind of taking the external factors, taking what of the company and going through, and saying, okay, are there pieces of this disclosure that that have changed or could be enhanced, or I'm seeing this from X other clients doing this. But I think that Keir's point is one of the most important ones, is kind of understanding the impact of going in and changing things. I always, when I'm talking with kind of brand new associates, the first thing is read the rule, but the other one is don't change things just because you think it sounds better. Go through and say, okay, is something wrong? Or is it missing something? Some kind of key, kind of key external or internal factor. But don't just change things to change things. I think we all kind of have that, I want everything to be perfect in my concept of what perfect is. And there are so many different factors that go into disclosure. So again, as long as I think something is accurate, not materially omitting and understandable, you can't kind of impose your own will on, well, I like this word better than that one, or, well, it would be, there's always that concept of, well, would it be better disclosure? Maybe it would be more disclosure, but is it necessary? And kind of working with, and working together to figure out what kind of the must-haves are versus the, well, you bear some risk if XYZ happens, there is some risk that there could be a question here, and just kind of working, together as all adults who want the best for the disclosure in the company, understanding that the person in-house knows the company inside and out in a way that you can't, and kind of treating each other as grown-ups and talking about and assessing risk, and saying, I think that there's significant risk here. I would, if you think that you can change this risk factor this much, this is what I would prioritize. So kind of just kind of working, I think, together, the two sides, or the internal and the external counsel. I bring with it maybe perspective on more current filings that I'm seeing across different folks, and then Keir on the other side, when he's working with his outside counsel, he brings this incredible knowledge of the organization and what's actually happening there. So that's how I approach it.
Great stuff. I mean, so far, this has been a mind-blowing panel, and I'm being serious. So Lily,
try not to drop off too much in the last few.
So Lily, I'm big in design, always have been, back into my days when I worked at R.R. Donnelley, in terms of graphics and charts. And then, it took a long time for that to become a thing, but it really has taken off in the last 5 years and maybe even 10. So from the law firm perspective, how much do you think about design when you draft, or are you relying really on other vendors for that?
I'm focused, at the end of the day, if I had an artistic bone in my body, maybe I would be doing something else. But I mean, I think about it in the context of working together, right? My expertise is going to be with the disclosure, the actual requirements. I know what different clients are doing. So I can say to someone, oh, well, a lot of folks are putting, this up front in their proxy summary or whatever. Or you may want to, talk to X, Y, or Z vendors about ways that you could, freshen up your presentation or, kind of tell your story in a more effective way. Let's say someone is only going to read the first 10 pages of your proxy or whatever. What do you really want to make sure is up front for them? But no, I'm more focused. I readily admit it. I have my area of expertise. I'm super glad there are people who have the more design related area of expertise. So what I'm going to do is be focused, on top of what the rules actually require and what I'm seeing in the market and what I think is good, clear disclosure. Also deference for the company's existing approach. Like, do you want 2 paragraphs on this, or are you a company that wants to have just the facts? So kind of deferring to that, and then understanding that they're going to fit it into whatever their overall design approach is. And I'm always happy to work with folks who kind of do the refreshes of, do it pretty regularly, or have in recent years on proxies and otherwise. But I do think there are people who are very, very good at that, and I'm happy to work hand in hand and always kind of look at final drafts and make sure that disclosures haven't kind of gotten lost in the process. But I do tend to rely on vendors for that.
And what about you, Keir?
I too have no artistic bones in my body.
No, you have a better aesthetic sense than I do.
Yeah, but not that much, not enough, unfortunately. So I'm with Lily on this one. I do focus on the design and the presentation and that sort of thing, but I really have very little to add than as a consumer, with one exception. And Lily said this earlier, it's worth emphasizing. I think that transparency and clarity point is super critical, and that includes the use of graphics. We all know the phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I do think that if you can find the right, graphic presentation of a concept, it can be very, very useful as a tool for communicating something to investors and to the public. And so I think that is a really useful element of thinking about design. On the other hand, I've seen, and I'm sure Lily, I'm sure both of you have, lots of instances where companies have lots of things all over the place and pictures and stuff, and you're just like, I don't understand what's the story. Like, what's the actual narrative here? It's like, I don't like graphics for graphics' sake. And so I do think there's a balancing act that you have to maintain in the use of graphics. But I think the organizing principle, as Lily said earlier, is totally around clarity and transparency. How can I use graphics to communicate my message effectively? I think that's really the starting point.
I do think you just to emphasize kind of the making sure that you're not losing something with the graphics. That's why I think it's so important to kind of have that partnership. Is maybe we come up with the disclosure, design does their magic, and then we look at it again to make sure that we nothing that the messaging and the disclosure is still kind of clear and saying what we need it to be saying. So I think it does need to be kind of a hand-in-hand process, whether it's the in-house folks who are doing that or outside counsel, but there should be kind of the check back in.
I agree completely. So Keir, when you are in charge of a disclosure team, as you are, what is your process to ensure that the people under you are delivering timely and competently?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I've had 2 very strong disclosure teams that I've worked with in-house, both here and at my prior company. And I think the starting point is, having really smart, competent people who care about disclosure. We're all securities geeks in a sense. And I've been fortunate in that in both organizations, I have people who really, really care about what it is that we're putting in these disclosures. They really take it to heart. And so, in both places, I like to have people who are very familiar with what the rules are. Again, going to what Lily said earlier, starting with, what's the disclosure document? Do we have a checklist that we use? That sort of thing. And then working through the process of identifying who's providing what disclosures, where those disclosures coming from, making sure we have backup from those disclosures. And I think the most important part of the process overall, is the role of the disclosure committee. I am a massive advocate of a fully functioning and engaged disclosure committee, where you bring in financial reporting and legal, and then you have each of the subject matter experts come in and kind of share, here's what's happening in my world this quarter, and then leaving that for the disclosure committee to assess, what needs to go in and what doesn't go in to the disclosure. And I'd say, and without fail, we have a disclosure committee meeting where we've got the draft document we've put together. We start with the outline, you start accumulating the information, you're putting in the outline, you're putting together the backup, you've got a document together, and then you get to the disclosure committee, you have a conversation, and inevitably there's something that comes out of that conversation where you realize, oh, I need to modify this, or we're completely missing the ball on this, or we need to do more diligence on this thing or the other. And so for me, that is by far the most important part of that process, is that event where you bring in all of those teams together, providing their input on the relevant disclosure document, as well as what's happening in the world, so you can make that decision about what to disclose or not to disclose.
And then Lily, I know you're not in charge of a disclosure team, but in working with your clients, what kind of things have you heard about what might make a process work?
I mean, I think it's just, kind of sitting down, working. I always kind of start with what's the desired time frame or required time frame, and working back from that and making sure that you kind of are bringing in your experts early on. So from my perspective, working with disclosure, with client teams, right, you kind of make sure that everyone understands and I think this translates to any team, kind of understanding the expectations and time frame, and making sure that people are communicating regularly with check-ins. And the kind of key thing, I think, for getting a good outcome on any project, I think wherever you are, is context. One of the key things are let's assume competence and all of timeliness and all this stuff. But I think when you're starting off on a new project or a new deliverable, working with a client, is kind of understanding why whatever it is you are doing matters. What is the larger context for it? Because I think that it's more interesting for the person doing the thing, to understand why it matters and how it fits into everything else. But I do think context is just a huge aspect of this. So if you have let's go back to the new disclosure requirements that we're all dealing with. If you have a new disclosure requirement and there's not kind of a basic working understanding of why the SEC thinks that disclosure requirement is appropriate at this point, it's going to be harder to create and review good disclosures. And so kind of understanding that overall context and then balancing that against market practice, kind of the specific disclosure approach and culture of a particular company you're working with. So I think that if you kind of get all of the context and expectations up front, the rest of the process will be much smoother. But beyond that, again, it's going to be, I think communication is the other key. It's context and communication, and kind of getting from A to B successfully, communicating with your client, communicating with your team, and just making sure everyone's on the same page about why you're doing something and why it matters.
And so now we're at the point, any other disclosure tips to offer, Lily?
Yeah. So I kind of come back to simplicity. I think with disclosure, sometimes we all get wrapped up in kind of the details, and this is complicated. And I've had really great mentors from the SEC and in private practice who were able to break down really hard things into true plain English. Keir and I started in Corp Fin in the peak of the plain English. I can't even imagine how many plain English comments we used to torture people with. But I think we both grew up in the plain English. And we've shared many of these great mentors who really did such a great job of being plain spoken. So I think simplicity is best. And when I'm talking with a client about a tricky disclosure and should I change this and can I do this? And if I don't kind of understand, if we're trying to work out what makes sense, I'll sometimes just kind of stop and say, okay, well, what happened? and how did the decision come about, and why does that matter? And then we try and work from there into how that can be put into the disclosure. And sometimes the answer is just, well, this happened this way, or we do it this way because of X. And that is something that can be said without, harming anyone from a confidentiality perspective, or, giving unnecessary, we always have to be conscious of, there are many different audiences for this disclosure, and thinking about plaintiffs' firms and whatnot, but sometimes it just helps to come back to the basics. Okay, so why does this matter? Okay, well, let's just say that. Or, why is this disclosure changing? Let's just say that. I mean, you have to, there's a lot of nuance to that, but I do think that many times the simple answer is the right answer in terms of telling your story. So I think just kind of go back to basics and simplicity. And I do think, and I understand and respect that in most instances, companies are not going to want to be changing things just to be changing things, right? There are all kinds of reasons that is a hard thing, but you have to change other things, or people may question, why are you changing it now? What changed? And overread into it. Some of it is just kind of the logistics of it. But to the extent that, something actually has evolved, and you feel like there's something to add, I do think it's fine to change disclosure if something's changed and you think that it makes sense and it's better disclosure. It doesn't mean you should go through changing everything every single time, but I think that you can just kind of go back to that basic principle of, okay, what actually happened and why are we doing this? Because companies they're not trying to do anything nefarious. They're just kind of doing what they're doing, and sometimes that doesn't come through in disclosure, and so you kind of step back and say, okay, how can we make this more clear? And so that's kind of my long, not simple answer, but at the end of the day, simplicity is best.
That was an excellent answer. The only thing I would add, I agree with everything that Lily said. As I think I've said 100 times already this morning. The only thing I would add is I always come back to disclosure is intended to provide the outside world with an inside view, full stop. And so no matter what the context is, whether it's business description, risk factors, MD&A, financial statements, accounting footnotes, any of it, what are the things that management is seeing and experiencing? What are the things that concern us? What are the things that excite us? And is that properly reflected in the disclosure, right? Like that's the key thing. And most often you find places where there's a gap between what management is seeing or is concerned about or is excited about and what they're saying. And I think the challenge and the opportunity for us as disclosure lawyers is to help thread that needle. So I know you don't want to say it this way. Can we say it that way? Can we add this? Can we do this? Because the disclosure, there really shouldn't be that gap between what's in the disclosure document and what management is actually thinking about and concerned about and excited about. And so that's it, Brock. I'd say that's my main tip. I always come back to that for any filing, proxy, 10K, 10Q, earnings release. Before I sign off, I just sit back and think, what are the things we're actually talking about inside the company? What are the things that we're worried about? What are the things we're excited about? And are those reflected? And if not, that's the beginning of the conversation.
So my final piece here is that I know I worked most of my career. You work your butt off on one thing and then you immediately move on to the next thing on your list, and you never take time to celebrate. So do you ever celebrate when you've wrapped up a nice piece of disclosure, or are you always on to the next thing? Keir?
I try to celebrate every day. I try to celebrate every win. I can't say that I celebrate when we push the button on our 10K, which we just filed, or the 10Q, but I do celebrate the proxy and annual meeting because I'm just so glad to be done with that process and if it's successful. But I need to celebrate more, Brock, is what I'm hearing from this conversation.
Agreed. It's easy to kind of jump to the next thing, but we do have to celebrate those victories. And I will say, as a dorky disclosure lawyer, it is nice. It's very satisfying when you have that nice tight piece of disclosure, text. So I will try to take this also as a reminder to pause and celebrate the beautiful disclosure wins.
So I'm embarrassed. I've never held a webcast on this topic before, and I can't imagine I'd two better people to have had this discussion with. I think this is the kind of video that's going to be watched years and years from now. Such sage guidance. I can't thank you both enough, Lily and Keir. Thank you.
Thank you, Brock.
Thank you, Brock. This is fun.
A pleasure.